Hey YouTube, welcome back. In the next 12 videos, we are going to be exploring church history. We, through the study of church history, get to go back in time to see what life was like for God's people who went before us. What challenges did they face? What was life like for them? What was the assignment God gave them to contend earnestly for the faith? These are just some of the questions that I look forward to learning as we dive deep into the study of church history. It is my prayer that the Holy Spirit will guide us through all of the opinions and controversies as we seek to find our calling and place here in this time that will honor the Lord. History is a touchy subject because it is often different based on who is teaching it and what perspective it's taught from. I am excited to start this journey with you to see what the Lord shows us and how he will use that understanding to fulfill our purpose on earth. So for today's video, we're going to be doing an overview of the major periods of church history, from the resurrection of Jesus Christ to the start of the European Reformation, which includes the ancient church, the Christian Empire, the early Middle Ages, the high point of the Middle Ages, and the late Middle Ages. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to ask you to please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. So let's start with the ancient church. I would define the ancient church as people who lived from the time that Jesus was resurrected from the grave all the way up until Constantine put an end to the persecution of Christians in the year 313 AD by putting into law the Edict of Milan. This was an exciting time when God ultimately fulfilled his eternal plan to save mankind, open up salvation to the Gentiles officially, and commanded his disciples to go into all the world and make disciples. As Christianity was getting established, there were some major challenges to the faith. Part of the controversy Christianity caused was the worship of Jesus and Jesus only, which stood in stark contrast to worshiping the emperor, which was required at that time. Some took the worship of Christ as a slap in the face to the emperor, which caused a lot of problems. This was a time of severe persecution for our Christian brothers and sisters. This persecution produced martyrs and apologists. God used apologists to defend the Christian faith against the accusations against it, and used the martyrs to demonstrate that God was real because people were actually willing to die for what they believed. The apologists produced some of the earliest theological works of Christianity, which birthed the first teachers of the faith after the apostles. People like Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and Cyprian wrote works that still affect us to this very day. Also in this time, many heresies, which attacked the core teachings of Christianity, were fought. It was because of this that the canon was created and also the Apostles' Creed. God used these people in a mighty way as he was building his church. So now we're going to move on to talk about the Christian Empire. The Christian Empire time period lasted from 313 AD up until 476 AD, when the last Roman emperor fell. This was a big shift in life for Christians. Christianity first became legal and then went on to become the official religion of the Roman Empire. What a switch! Constantine was used by God for this purpose. The question then remains, was Constantine a real Christian or not? We know that his mom was, which is why he was sympathetic to Christians and wanted to end the persecution. So was Constantine a Christian? There are a lot of opinions on this, but I guess we will just have to wait to find out if Constantine's conversion was real, and we will see if he's in heaven or not when we get there ourselves. At this time, Christianity shifted from being mostly comprised of poor people to include people from the aristocracy. They were getting saved too. This legalization of Christianity caused people to go in a couple of different directions. Some were enjoying the new situation without all the persecution, while others went out to the wilderness to live the monastic life. Many others continued living in society, but with a biblical worldview. Without the threat of persecution, the church started to produce really, really great teachers, but also brought in many members who were not real committed Christians. Great theological and spiritual doctrines were realized at this time, but it was also a time of great disagreement on these doctrines. The biggest doctrinal issues were those which dealt with the Trinity and the issue of Arianism. This period came to an end when German people came and settled into the Roman Empire. This group was known as the barbarians. Rome was attacked by the Goths, and a lot of people were roughed up. It was a very violent time with these barbarians. Romulus Augustus was the very last Roman Empire who got run down the road in the year 476 AD. So now we're going to switch to talk about the early Middle Ages. The early Middle Ages period starts in 476 AD with the fall of Romulus Augustus when he got run down the road, which was the fall of the Roman Empire that ends with the split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, which is also known as the Schism. That's the split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. The Roman Empire got divided up into two main sections. The Eastern section is where Greek was spoken, and the Western section is where Latin was spoken. These two sections of Rome did different things to the church. The invasion of the barbarians had a much bigger influence on the Western Church, which is today Spain, France, and Italy, as they had to deal with all of the shenanigans. Instead of being under an emperor's control, it was replaced by barbaric territories. Much of the ancient culture disappeared, except for where it was preserved within the church. Back in the Eastern section, the Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, continued strong for another 1,000 years and was a stronger influence than the church. This caused the state to have much more power and influence than the church did on society. So this caused the state to have more power than the church did on society, which is what we see today. The state secularism has more power on society than the church does, by far. Many Christological issues were dealt with at the multiple ecumenical council meetings. Also during this time, Islam evolved, around 610 AD, when Muhammad began his religious teachings. Muhammad fled to Medina around 622 AD, making this a brand new era for Muslims. By the time Muhammad died around 632 AD, he had conquered most of Arabia. The Western Church was powerful, but it had issues to face, both from within and from the barbarians, which led to a lot of disorder. Each feudal lord followed his own policies, and some were actually known to go to war with one another. However, in the Eastern Church, there seemed to be order, and it is here in the Eastern Church where the knowledge of antiquity is preserved the best. One good thing that came out of this time is that the gospel spread to Russia around 988 AD, and all of the tension between the Eastern Church and the Western Church is what caused the split, or what's known as the schism. So now we're going to go on and talk about the high point of the Middle Ages. The high point of the Middle Ages, this period in church history dates from the split between the Eastern and Western Church in 1054 AD, all the way up to the beginning of the decline of the papacy in 1303 AD. The Western Church was in need of some tender loving care, and God responded by using monks. The monastics whose hearts were wanting to fix things came into the power of the papacy, which paved the way for some popes to change things. This caused a lot of tension and conflict between the popes and the emperors in the everlasting battle between the church and secularism. And that battle rages on today, the church and secularism. Are we going to listen to God's word, or are we going to listen to man's word? This was also the time in which the Crusades happened, beginning in 1095 AD. We're going to be learning more about the Crusades in depth in a very near future video. The Crusades caused commerce and trade to flourish and cities to grow, which fueled trade. There was a brand new class of people called the bourgeoisie, which were middle-class city folk, the bourgeoisie. These people lived by trade and were ripe for industry. The Franciscans and the Dominicans arose at this time, and they supported themselves by begging. They got teaching positions at universities, and they developed a leading theology of the time known as scholastic. Beautiful cathedrals came to be because of the great growth of the cities, and church architecture changed from Romanesque, which is Roman style, into Gothic. These Gothic cathedrals are some of the most impressive and beautiful structures of all time. Innocent III brought the papacy to its power peak, but in about 100 years, the papacy's power would decline significantly. So the late Middle Ages, this period ranges from the very first signs of the papacy's decline in 1303 AD to the ultimate fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD. This time period is the beginning of what we know as modern nations. Unfortunately, this nationalism negatively affected the unity of God's church. France and England had the 100 Years' War at this time, and other parts of Europe were also drawn into the battle. Also during this time in Europe, the Great Plague happened, which dwindled the population and caused economic ruin. The papacy declined at a very fast rate. France had the papacy under its control, which caused it to move from Rome to Avignon, which was practically on the border of France. This downward spiral also led to the schism of Avignon, which is the split of the Western Church. From the years 1378 AD all the way until 1423 AD, there were sometimes 2 or even 3 people claiming that they were the Pope at the very same time. In order to heal the church and make changes towards reform, the conciliar movement came into the picture. They were able to help, and the church agreed on one pope. A side effect of this was that the conciliar movement itself split into 2 groups, which led to there being one pope, but 2 totally separate councils. The popes of this time fell to the lure of the world by the Renaissance period. The pull of the world is very powerful, and we all have to be careful not to fall to the lure of the world. They were more interested in building beautiful buildings than they were in the spiritual health of the flock that God had entrusted to them. Ivory tower theologians in the universities were losing the common person, making scholastic theology unfruitful. The Lord raised up people like John Wycliffe, Girolamo Savonarola, John Huss, and others to bring the flock back into the sheep pen. So, in conclusion, I cannot reiterate enough the statements that I made in the introduction to this video any better. This study is perfectly timed in my walk with the Lord, and I am very happy to be studying church history with you. Church history is fascinating, and it is my prayer that it will spur us on to our own callings. Thank you for watching. Please hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.